Hey guys, welcome back to the Headwaters channel. Seth here, and today we are going to be talking about what I have recently found to be, in my opinion, the best river fishing kayak on the market in 2022. This is a boat Dan's been telling me to try out for seemingly forever. So recently I was going on a river trip, paddling the John Day, which is a 5-day trip up in north central Oregon, and he was just like, oh, you should take this guy out. And so he lent it to me. I took it down the river and really got to spend some quality time in it. So before I say which boat it is, I want to touch on what I look for in a kayak specifically for river fishing. You need slightly different performance for something when you're fishing a river than you do if you're fishing a lake or a small pond or an ocean, right? The first thing that I actually look for is speed. And I realize that's kind of a weird term because, we've talked about fast kayaks on the channel a lot lately, and it might seem like I'm talking about one of these super narrow sit-on-tops like we did in our, performance sit-on-top review, and that's not what I'm talking about at all. But you do need some amount of speed in order to be effective on the river, right? For me, especially if I'm bass fishing on a river, I find a lot of success in the eddies, right, off of the main current. And in a lot of cases, especially in this case on the John Day, you want to be able to catch as many of those eddies as possible. A way to be really effective with that is to be able to ferry across the river. So if you've got an eddy on, the right side of the river, and you want to get to an eddy that's also on the left side of the river, and there's only a little bit of separation in downriver space, you need to be able to paddle upstream to fight that current to be able to catch that second eddy. So that's what our ferrying is. If you have a really slow kayak and you're trying to ferry and you're trying to fight that current, it's just gonna push you downstream, push you downstream, push you downstream. It's gonna be really frustrating. If you have a kayak that's got a healthy amount of speed, it'll be pretty easy to just face upstream, work your way across that current, catch that second eddy, and get all the fish that are in there too. The second characteristic I'm looking for is actually stability. And this is what makes it tricky because speed and stability typically kind of fight each other. Your main characteristic that determines that is going to be the width. And so if you have a really wide kayak, that's great. It's probably going to be really stable, but that width is also going to make it slow. So it makes it tricky when I'm looking for a good river fishing kayak to find something that I like, because I want it to be fairly fast, but I also want it to be stable enough that I feel comfortable paddling it down a river, so I don't feel like I'm going to flip out every time I get into some little riffles and rapids. The third thing I'm looking for is maneuverability. If you see a spot that looks really fishy, you want to be able to turn really quick, get over there, get a cast in. If you see some kind of obstacle in the river, right, you want to be able to dodge that. You need to be able to maneuver quickly. So maneuverability is extremely important to me as well when I'm looking for a good river fishing kayak. And my fourth thing finally is going to be storage space. Obviously having room for gear when you're fishing is important. I also really love multi-day fishing trips. So being able to throw a tent and a sleeping bag and all of my gear into the boat, onto the boat somewhere where it's not in the way of fishing is also really important. That being out there, now we're gonna roll this boat in and I'm gonna talk about why it is just blowing my mind for river fishing. Without further ado, my nomination for the best river fishing kayak of 2022 is the Feel Free Moken 12.5. Okay, so let's talk about what this kayak has going on that has me so pumped about it. When we talk about the kind of needs that you have in a river fishing kayak that I was discussing earlier, right? You want good speed, you want good stability, you want good maneuverability, you want a good amount of storage. You need this to be in a package that paddles well, right? Because in a river, you do still want a boat that paddles. The specifications that the Moken 12.5 has fill that niche just so very well. It's 12 feet 6 inches long, 32 inches wide, weighs 85 pounds, and has a capacity of 400 pounds. So that gives me the right amount of length that it can still track pretty well, but it's not going to be so long that it won't maneuver. It still maneuvers great. 32 inches, in my opinion, is a great width for a boat for river fishing. If it got much wider, it would be really stable, but it wouldn't paddle very well. If it got much narrower, it would be super fast, but it wouldn't be very stable. And 400 pounds, while I'm nowhere near that weight, of course gives me a ton of capacity to pack gear, fishing gear, camping gear, whatever it might be, and really get this thing loaded and still have it perform the way that it's meant to. Like I mentioned initially, I got to test this out in some awesome conditions for testing a kayak, 5 consecutive days of paddling it every day, 79 miles of paddling. Some fairly intense, class 3 rapids all the way into flat water. I had some great situations to test it in ferrying, peeling in and out of eddies. I mean, I really got to put this thing through the motions for exactly what it's capable of on the river, and I was extremely impressed. I think one of the things I really didn't expect was to be able to ferry and attain, right? Ferrying across the river to get from eddy to eddy. One morning I tested this out at camp, and I just hopped in the eddy that was right next to our camp that we had pulled into our campsite at, and ferried across the river to an eddy that was almost parallel. And this was right below a rapid, so there was pretty healthy current, and the Moken just paddled pretty easily across from one rapid to the other without me having to put in too much effort. And it's even capable of attaining, right? So attaining would be where you're actually paddling up current. And in moderate current, this thing would actually still cut through the water well enough to make progress upstream. This is also important to me in river fishing because if I blow past an eddy that looks really fishy, I can pull back around, grab what's almost an eddy but still has some current coming downstream, attain back up that current, and get back to the eddy that I missed. And I kid you not when I say that on this 79 miles of river, I left almost no eddy untouched. A lot of the reason I was able to do that is because of the capable speed of the Moken 12.5. As far as stability goes, I really appreciated the ability to adjust the height of a seat. That's a pretty standard thing in fishing kayaks these days, but when running rapids, being able to put the seat down low and preserve some stability, give yourself a healthy center of gravity where you can brace and make sure that you're getting where you need to be, not feeling like you're going to tip over the whole time, is huge. I would say I felt extremely comfortable actually running strong rapids in this boat. Then when I got done with the rapids, I'd pop my seat back up high, get those better ergonomics, get really comfortable, be easier to stand up and stretch out. Speaking of standing up and stretching out, I was actually really surprised by how easily I could stand up in this boat. It has a little stand-up strap, which I didn't even end up using, but I stood up in it a lot. I actually brought a fly rod with me on the river as well as my spinning rod, and was pretty stoked to stand up every once in a while when I was fly fishing and really lay out a few longer casts that I couldn't quite get sitting down. As far as maneuverability goes, I was actually blown away. 12 feet is really that tipping point where a lot of kayaks start to not maneuver as well. So I wasn't actually expecting a 12.5-foot boat to be able to do the things that I wanted to. But, the first major rapid on the run that we did, there's a very easy line you can take on the left where you just sneak it. And then there's a much more difficult line. There's a really big, feature on the right and a pretty big feature in the center. And you can kind of go right between them. And you got to come in straight and then suddenly turn diagonal and paddle between the two. And if you went into either one of them, it would be a pretty bad time. When I looked at the rapid, my initial plan was just to go left and avoid everything. And then as I was coming up to it, I was like, just go for it. So I decided to go take that fading, right to center line. And even as I was coming up to it, I started to realize this is actually a more intense move than I realized it was going to be in the first place. And I came up and just was able to turn the boat so fast in the direction that I needed to go and paddle straight across the river, easily avoid both of those holes, and just go right in the wave train. It handled it really well. And that's something I didn't expect. That was a huge surprise. And one of the first moments on this trip where I was just like, wow, this kayak is really good at handling these environments. Even beyond that, just peeling in and out of eddies, which is something that I typically don't even do in a fishing kayak. I'll usually take the easy way and kind of just paddle into an eddy. But this boat was able to edge well enough to actually peel into an eddy and then ferry back into the current and head back downstream, which are usually things that I only do in pretty solid performing kayaks. So really impressed with the maneuverability of this boat. As far as storage space goes, thing was totally adequate. And once again, this was for 5 days and 4 nights on the river. Bunch of gear in the back of the boat, bunch of gear in the front of the boat, and it handled it all great. So unless you are close to that 400-pound weight capacity, say you weigh 300 pounds and you've got 100 pounds of gear, probably wouldn't go this route with this boat. It's got a lot of your standard stuff, of course, right? It's got a big open front hatch like most fishing kayaks do. It's got your rear tank well for you to put a crate in and so on, but also has a lot of thoughtful kind of just little things thrown in there. On both sides, there are horizontal rod holders that just come on the boat. And I didn't even realize that at first. I thought it was just paddle holders on both sides. And then I looked back and realized that there's also bungee paddle holders on both sides behind that. And then of course there's rod tip protectors up on the bow to pair with those horizontal rod holders on the side, which is really neat. Another thoughtful little thing is that the rod holders actually have bungees with little clips on them. They're little paddle leashes that are just built into the rod holders, which I think is really cool. If you flip on a river, anything that's not tied down is gone. So if you love it, leash it is the saying, right? So it's neat to have those leashes built in. And they also have a little built-in tie-down system for your crate, which I did end up using. I think that's really nifty because most boats, they just give you bungee to hold a crate, which doesn't hold it in place really well. This does have the bungee behind that tie-down, but there's a specific little area that's like the shape of a crate that fits one perfectly. And it comes with these built-in tie-downs that strap it down, and that worked great for my setup. So there are some really thoughtful additions to the storage setup on this boat that actually were really helpful in a river fishing kayak. There are really only a couple of things that I think could be better. The first one is the little storage box up front. So it's a neat box, and it's cool. You can mount a fish finder on it and have all of your electronics inside and the transducer on the bottom. You can use it as storage and so on. It's a great idea. I think my only complaint is when you're paddling through waves a ton like I was on this trip, on the daily, it was filling up with water because it's not fully dry. It's semi-dry, right? There's no gasket. That said, you know, the difference in cost of making a box that's fully dry versus one that's semi-dry, especially if you're running, you know, putting holes in it to mount electronics and so on. Yeah, probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but it would be neat to have an option to have just a fully dry box up there if I just wanted to put camping gear in it. I'd probably even buy a separate one just to have one that I use as a dry box on river fishing trips and one to have a full, you know, fish finder sonar system mounted on if I was going fishing on a lake or in the ocean or something like that. So it'd be cool just to have that option. The other thing that I would love to see, should there be a Moken 3.0 at some point in time, is just a little more rocker. The only thing that I wasn't super crazy about was just plugging into somewhat, you know, healthy sized waves. Of course, there aren't many kayaks out there these days that are still made for going over waves or cutting through waves. Very nearly any kayak on the market, if you're going through a wave that's more than 2 feet tall, is going to plug straight into them. But I think it would be cool to see some river fishing kayaks on the market that have more rocker so that they want to go over the wave and perform a little better in those choppier and more intense conditions. I was running a couple of class 3 rapids in this scenario and a lot of class 2s, which isn't really what fishing kayaks are made to do. So I was really impressed with how well it handled in those conditions based on the fact that it wasn't really made to handle those conditions in the first place. So overall, of course, very impressed with the Moken 12.5's performance on the river. It easily checks all my boxes for speed, stability, maneuverability, and storage, and really is just a knockout punch for a river fishing kayak. That's going to do it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave us a like. If you want to see more content like this, hit the subscribe button because we've got more content coming. And if you've got any questions about the Moken or kayak fishing, kayaking in general, leave those in the comments. Thanks again for watching. Happy paddling.